Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me. As people start to come in, I'll just give a real quick introduction and we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. So today we're going to be having a little discussion about theme.json and supports, which is a specific aspect.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone, but if you have anything you'd like to share with us, just let me know and I'll get you unmuted. All right, so we're going to talk about theme supports and see if I can actually get the mute working. Maybe I can't. All right, well, we'll do the best we can. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to keep on admitting people as they pop in. And so let's go ahead and get started. So the idea behind theme supports is actually, let's start with a little housekeeping. First, this meeting is recorded. I will be sharing it via my YouTube. There's a link to the playlist that I'm placing them all in the meetup description. If you are at all concerned about your video being in the recording, feel free to turn off your video sharing, and the same for your audio. But this is a safe place for discussion, and we're all here learning together. And I hope that others will have information that maybe I'm not aware of or isn't at the top of my mind, and we can all come away with something valuable at the end of this. And if you know the answer to a question or you have something to add, please go ahead and share that, whether that be a voice or in the chat box. Right. So what are supports in theme.json? So first of all, they are Boolean values. They are true, false. They're going to either be turned on or turned off. They are there in order to enable or disable certain block editor features, whether you'll enable or disable them based on what you would like to have your site owners or your content creators have available to them. And let's see, I'm just going to quickly get myself a co-host here so that she can give me a hand with some of the logistics. All right. Okay. And then these supports you can have be at a global level, which is what we'll be looking at today, or a block level. So before we get too far in, I wanted to take a look at a JSON file. So here we have the theme JSON that comes with the 2022 theme. The purpose of this file, if you're not familiar with it, is to basically be a configuration file for your theme. It's going to be where all of your settings go. If you have custom templates, you want to declare for certain post types. If you have styles that you want to set, presets. Next week, I'm pretty sure that we're talking about the preset aspect of the settings area of theme.json, and today we're looking at the supports. So when I talk about presets, I'm talking about things like you have a list of things that will then become available to select from within the block editor. And the supports are the true false things. We're saying, okay, in this case, the appearance tools feature, which is actually a group of features we'll talk about, is set to true. So any blocks that have that enabled will have them present in the block editor when you're creating your content. So there are a number of these, and let's go ahead and switch back over here and look at what some of them are. And we'll go into the WordPress admin area so you can see what will happen if we add and remove support for some of these things. So, so the border section is going to have supports related to adding borders to things. And these include whether you want to have your borders have an option to set a color, to set a border radius, which would give you the ability to have rounded corners, the style, which is like the dash or dot or solid, and the width of that border. So how many pixels or other units wide you would like that to be. So that is one area. And probably the best place to look at this, I lost my test site. Here it is. Maybe it's not. Okay, here we go. I'm going to go ahead and create a new post. So I have a site I just set up a few minutes ago. It's completely fresh, except I created a very, very simple child theme just so that we have something to work with. So I'm going to create a new post. And I'm going to add some buttons because this is we'll be able to use this to demonstrate a few different things. I don't need to add links or anything to these. I just need to be able to work with them. So in here, I've got my buttons block and each button. And then on the buttons, I have over in the settings for that block, the button block, is this borders panel. And in here, we have just radius. So if I create one for, let's say, a group, I'm pretty sure group will have more of those options available to us. And I open that up, and here we have all of them. So we have the width, the style, the color, and the radius. So if I wanted to say, I'm going to set the color to red, I'm going to set the width to 100 pixels, and I'm going to make the style solid. So I made a giant border around this. A 100 pixel border is pretty extreme. And then if I wanted to make rounded corners, I can just control this. And then you can actually also separate these out into being different from each other. So if you wanted to have like that kind of a shape, this is how you would do that. So this is what those controls are. And in this case, on the group block, they are all enabled by default, or either by default or by the theme, depending on our situation. So let's go over back to our theme.json and move down to, make sure that I have the right file open here. Need to move something out of the way. Okay, yep, so I'm in my child theme and in the theme JSON. So I'm going to go into settings. And then I'm going to collapse a few things so it's a little easier to see. Okay, and there are no border settings. First of all, I'm gonna set this to false because it does a few things and I don't want it to interfere with the other stuff that we're demonstrating here. So I am going to add a border section. I must not have a schema in here. Just actually sure if that's it. One moment, let me go get the URL for this because it'll be a lot faster to go through this if I have it.
Daisy, you're also
Yes.
missing the comma after the URL.
Yeah, I just don't know that I had the URL right.
Okay.
Let's see if I had it right in my head. I was close. Okay. Now if I go back down here, oh, border would probably work better. And then I'm going to open up some more brackets here. And now I can say I'm going to set everything to false for right now. Oops. Oops. I hit the wrong key and it takes off on me. Okay. So now I've set all of these to false. I'm going to save this. Except I'm missing a comma now. I can see that I had an error for color, and it was because I had skipped adding the comma after my brackets. All right, so that looks like it's saved now. Let's figure out where my screen is here. All right, and now if I go back into this post again now, and I can see that nothing has changed on the block that I created, but when I select this block now, I'm selecting the group block, and now the border option has gone away completely. I can no longer edit the border on this block. It doesn't change what I had previously added before it was disabled, but now the option to set these settings is no longer available to me for this. And that's going to be across the whole site. Anywhere that has those border controls, now they will be disabled. So that's the purpose of these supports, is to be able to kind of curate the experience that you're going to give your content creators so they have just the settings that they need in order to create the content in the format that they need for their site. So while WordPress out of the box is going to be extremely permissive and give lots of options, as a site builder or a theme builder, you can actually lock this down to be a lot more of a bespoke experience. So this is just one example. And then if I go back and work with those same settings again in my file, like if I only set, let's say I just wanted to give them the option, I don't want them to change the color, I don't want them to change the style or the width, but I do want to allow them to add the rounded corners. I'm not sure that that's something that this scenario might not be very real, but if I just change that one thing to true and reload the screen again, then and I select that block, now you can see border has returned. And if I expand that, the only option here is going to be the radius. So those are the options for border. And so you can enable and disable each of those 4 things in your theme JSON. And let's go on to color. Now, I'm pretty sure that was the next one. Yeah. So the color option is going to be a little bit more complex. So this is going to affect more areas of your site or of your block editor. And we can go through each of these and show what they do and how to turn them on and off. So I kind of separated these out into groups a little bit. So we've got the background link and text settings. So we'll look at those together. We have the default colors section, which is what will pull in the colors that are defined at the WordPress level as palettes and options for the different color things. And then custom, whether or not the content editor should be able to create their own colors in the color palette, their own duotone combinations, and their own gradients. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that now. So I'm going to go back over here again. I'm going to leave the border section the way it is. When I expand the color section of the theme JSON here, there's a lot in here already because this theme registered some duotones, gradients, and a color palette. But these are what are called presets, where we're populating the palettes with certain settings to be available. And what we're talking about right now is enabling and disabling certain design controls. So when I do this, and I'm using the schema. For anyone who was here last week, we talked about the kind of the helper tool of schema when it comes to building these JSON files. I can see all of these options, the ones that were in my slide, are available to me to add. And what is here, I'm going to go ahead and add background. This is defaulted to true. And so let's go ahead and save that, and I'll show you where that shows up here. So if I have anything here that's going to have a color, and it's going to give me these options in this panel. So right now I have a button block selected, and I have text and background. Right now they're both enabled, and there's a third one that will sometimes show up in here if I have something that's a link. So if I go ahead and add a link here, then I should also be able to, oops, maybe not on that. I'll try adding a link in here. Here we go. So in a paragraph, I get all three of them. I can set a background color. I can set text color. And I can set a link color. So there you can see the 3 color options that are on a paragraph block. Now, if I go back over to my theme.json again, and I'll add the text option. And I'm going to actually set the default. And I'm going to add the link. And then I'm also going to change background to false. So those are the 3 options for just choosing these color options that are available in the blocks. And now if I refresh this, I'll go ahead and save my draft so that we don't lose what I added. And now we have our block. So I have the paragraph block selected. And I can see that the color option has actually been removed entirely. So it's no longer available in the sidebar. And if I change any of those items back to true, then that option would show up again. All right, and I'm going to take a second to switch back over to the chat box to see if we have any questions I can get to now. So Lisa's asked if a support is not specifically declared as true or false in theme.json, what happens? That's a great question. It'll use the default for that. And in the developer handbook, there's this theme.json living document, and it lists all of the options that you have available for settings. And it also tells us whether they're enabled by default or disabled by default with the true or false. So true and false doesn't turn off the theme setting for it, though. It's to allow users to change it. Yes, so it's all about the design control in the block settings that you see when you're editing your content. It does not change the presence of that. You can still set a default for it and not have it be overridden. And that goes into the styles section. We're gonna talk about that at some point in this series. where we'll talk about how to set up the styles to provide those default design controls, whether or not they're visible to the content creator. Let's see. Michael says, yes, there are certain defaults, right? And the theme.json gives users the control and option to disable supports that you don't need to offer to the editing interface, right? Lisa says the 100 pixel border was more like a background. Yes, it was mostly just there to make it really obvious and apparent that that's what I was doing, but it did look an awful lot like a background color. Let's see. Oh, and Carlos shared the link to the theme.json, which is where that, so there's a link, a fairly long GitHub user content link that is the theme.json schema. And then we have a shortened version that we'll use that redirects. Let's see. If theme.json support is false, can CSS be changed normally otherwise? So you have a couple of things going on here. One is you have the defaults that are coming in from WordPress that are going to apply some very basic formatting to your blocks, just so that they, have some structure, that you can actually see the things. You don't have white on white or anything like that. Then you have your style settings that are going to come in from your theme.json that gets converted into CSS and applied to your blocks. And then you would have any custom CSS. So basically what's really happening when the blocks all have classes, it's just HTML markup, and you're applying classes, and those classes can be targeted with CSS in order to provide the design. So the global style system and the theme.json styles section are where the majority of that is starting to happen for a block theme, or if you're using theme.json on a block supported classic theme, you can also use the same thing there. And so your CSS doesn't really change with this, although you're going to, I would recommend where possible, you want to set your defaults in your theme.json styles to match what you want most of the time for your site. Deb asks, does the 2022 theme have everything all supports equals true? I think it's mostly the defaults. So we can go through here. We did add a few. I think that they are mostly just using the defaults. The drop cap is set to false, but I think that might be the only one in this theme. I guess there was some design issue with drop caps, and so the theme team decided to disable that for this theme. But I'm pretty sure everything else by default is set to the defaults, with the exception, actually, there's one other one, drop cap and appearance tools, which we'll talk about shortly. For link color supports and settings in theme.json, are all states impacted? Link visited hover. I'm not sure that there's anything that separates those out at present. If anyone does know that, the answer to that question, or have some tip for how to handle that in a child theme, that would be really cool. But I think it's just a simple color. I don't like, this has some kind of a hover, and I think if we go ahead and preview this on the front end, I'm getting like a dashed line on hover. Probably that's being added somewhere in the theme. Let's see. On hover, I've got in style.css, it's adding this text decoration style to dashed on the a hover and a focus. So that is not being controlled by the block editor in this case. Maybe at some point that'll be expanded on, because I think that that would be helpful to be able to set some basic state styling. Okay. All right. Michael shared the living JSON documentation, theme JSON documentation, rather. There's a link in the chat. Thank you for doing that. Tanya says, excuse the newbie question, but with the true false settings in color, if a theme was missing the ability in the editor to set the color link, I could add that line and set it to true for links to make it available. If the block supports that design control, then yes, you can use that. But if the theme was missing the ability for those that are defaulted to true, then it means it's being disabled somewhere, and adding it to theme JSON may or may not add it back, depending on what was done at the theme level. Carlos says theme.json only controls whether you can use the features from the block editor. You still need to add the CSS manually. Then to correct myself, the supports we're discussing today only control whether a setting is available on the editor. There are areas of theme JSON that will, there are areas of theme JSON that will generate CSS classes for you to use. That's correct. So, and we will get to how to work with the styles that generate. So the presets will be used to generate CSS custom properties or variables, and then those variables can be used along with other just straight values in the styles area to actually apply the design. Okay, let's carry on. We're about 30 minutes in. So let's move on. So we talked about these three color options: background, link, and text. They're all pretty straightforward. Too far. Okay, background, link, and text. Now let's look at default, duotone, gradients, and palette. So WordPress is bringing some default values in just to give you a starting point. So if I go into my site again, and then I pick something that has a color picker, what I'm going to get is these color options. So at the top, this says theme. These should be the color options that are being added by the theme. They look a little funny to me for some reason. And maybe they are the colors that are added by the theme. So they actually look like they're gradients though. It's interesting. Let's try something else with the color.
I think so.
It's still adding the gradients in. That's interesting that it's.
I think so. All right, love.
All right, let me. Sarah, can you mute everyone?
Well, I don't think we can.
Okay. All right. I'm not sure why these are showing up as the gradients in the theme instead of the palette. That is a little strange. Maybe it's because it has a gradient on it here. Oops.
Daisy, the bottom
Yes.
two seem to be empty colors, so that may be under theme. The lower two items appeared as white to me, looking at the screen.
Okay.
So that may be where you pick plain colors from the palette.
Yeah, it's so. These are all just gradients. Oh, maybe it's because I actually have things disabled. I forgot to turn it back on. So right now it was only showing me the gradients, but not the color palette. So let me go ahead and add these back to true. See if that works. Okay, here we go. Now we're seeing some colors. So now if I pick this, then we see the color palette. I wonder about that gradient option, if that is actually supposed to be happening, because my expectation would be that I would get no option for color for those things. Fascinating. So now if I go back to one of the ones that I was having, so now I have solid and gradient as options, and it was only showing me the gradient before. So the theme palette are these 5 colors. There's a black, a white, a green, a tan, and I guess another white. And if you hover over them, you're going to see the names that they've been provided, which in this case are foreground, background, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And you can see here that the background and the tertiary color are actually the same. And you might think that you don't need to include it twice if it's there twice. But if you were to, at some point in the future, want to use a different color for tertiary without changing the background color, this would allow you that control to keep them separated from one another. So based on where they are, it's a little bit of semantic naming conventions to make it a little easier for future you. And then, so those are the colors that are added in the theme palette in the presets of settings and theme.json. The ones below that are the default colors. We've got a number of colors that are added by WordPress. I'm not sure exactly why it's these particular colors, but these are just ones that are added. And so what we can do is disable the default colors so that they are not available. You know, if you don't want your content creators to have access to this vivid orange color, for example, you'd probably want to remove this default palette. So let's go ahead and do that now. And to do that, we're going to say default palette is the key that we're going to use. And instead of setting it to true, we're going to set it to false. And now when we go back over to the site, and I select something that has that color option and set the background, any of the color palette options, you can see now that default palette has gone away. We only have our theme palette to work with. This box up top is to set a custom color. So if I click on that, this rectangle here with the checkerboard, it pulls up a color picker, and I can pick any color I want. I can either choose I can use the selector tool, or I can set a hexadecimal code, or RGB, or HSL. So, so this is the custom color option. So if I go back over here and I see I have custom in this list, if I disable custom, and this one I think could come in handy for a lot of people. To be able to make it so you cannot just choose any color. So you see that rectangle, that checkerboard has gone away, and now I can only pick from the colors declared by the theme. Let's see. So Deb has a question. Is there some kind of map of hierarchy of what might control CSS? So yes, but what you get are, we'll get to this in a future session where we start talking about the styles area and how that actually applies to your block, like how it changes the way that the blocks look. So basically the presets, all of these settings are applying classes to your block markup, and then the styles are going to be what generates the CSS for that to make it look right. So a little outside of the scope of this session, unfortunately, but stay tuned for future styles oriented things. So a key, I don't know if I said that right. I apologize if I didn't. Is it possible to override default palette? So you would not override the default palette exactly, but you can remove it and add your own palette, which is what we would do with the presets in the theme.json, which I have collapsed here, but there's this option for palette here. And if I expand that, you can see that all of the colors that are in the themes palette are present here. And this is where you would add your custom colors, not actually to override the default colors. Now you could potentially add colors that have the same names and same slugs as the default colors and override them in that way. But typically, I think the custom palette is going to be your better choice. Okay, moving on. So we looked at removing the default palette and also removing the option for a custom color. Let's move on to what we can do with Duotone. So Duotone are the two color pairs that you would apply to an image to basically recolor it to be a colorized version of grayscale, basically. So so if I do the same thing that I did for the default palette for default Duotone and set that to false, before I save this, let me just demonstrate what this looks like. So I'll have to add an image of some kind, I think. Find an image to add. Oh, how about a Wapuu? They're always good. I don't know what this is going to do when the line drawing might not work real well with Duotone, but we'll see. So when I have my block selected in the little toolbar that shows up right along with the block, I have this dotted circle that is the apply Duotone filter. And if I click that, then I'm given the duotones that are declared by the theme, and also the option to create my own duotone from, right now it's only from the palette colors because I've disabled the option to choose a custom color. If I were to turn that back on, then I would actually be able to pick any color for these shadows and highlights. So if I just go ahead and click on that, then this is what it looks like with this. If you're using a photograph, I think it's a little bit more appealing because you get a lot of variation. It looks kind of cool. But this is how that works. And so now if I go in and, you know, this default duotone, I'm a little unclear on because I didn't see a default duotone set there. So it may be that this is something that's not quite ready yet. But we can go ahead and add in custom duotone and set that to false. And then with those two things, we can reload. Okay, and now if I go into Duotone, it reverted because I didn't save. If I click apply Duotone filter now, then the option to select my own two colors has gone away and I can only select from the presets. So Michael asked the question, does the default duotone rely on default palettes that being set to true? Possibly. Let's find out. We'll set that to true. we'll leave custom to false. And let's change the default duotone back to true. Nope. We still just have the theme things. And I have a feeling that the default duotone options may be coming for WordPress 6.0. If I activated Gutenberg on this, it might change the way this looks. Right now, I don't have Gutenberg activated, so I'm trying to keep things to what you can do right now without Gutenberg plugin installed and activated. So, and things are changing so quickly. More features are being added. I haven't seen a lot that's going to change as far as what's already been put out, but lots of new things coming. All right, so that was duotone, and then the gradients work the same way. So we have gradients added by the theme. So you can see that we've got these, whoa, a little too fast there. These named gradients, vertical, secondary to background, and then the gradient has basically the CSS applied to it here. So we're setting a linear gradient and all of the settings for that. And within that, we have a variable. And this variable is pulling from the theme's color palette. So it's the color secondary is what would be applied here. And we'll get into more of those variable settings when we, probably next week, we'll start talking about what how those are created as part of the presets. All right, so if I go back down to where I was, and now I can add those last two options. I've got custom gradient, which by default is set to true. Oops. And I know the default is set to true because the schema told me that. And then default gradients is also set to true. I'm going to leave those set that way, and we'll go back and look at them. And now if I go in, let's find something with the option to set a gradient. Okay, so now if I go into gradients, I can see here we have our theme gradients. These are the 3 or the 8 options that are set. They all look pretty minimal to me. Like we've got a straight line, but the colors are relatively light. Maybe it would be easier to see if I did not have this giant border around it. But I turned off borders, so removing it would be difficult from here. We'll add in the group. Okay. And now on this group, I can add a new background color with a gradient. Let's say I wanted to have this one here, and you can kind of see that it's like this tan color. It goes into a white or a very, very pale tan. But then we have the default gradients that are a little bit more colorful. So here we've got something that kind of goes from orange to like a periwinkle color, or this one's got a few different colors in it. And you can create these from these settings. Right now, because I have the option to create custom gradients enabled. But let's see what happens if I disable that. I'm going to go ahead and save this draft. And let's go ahead and turn off our default gradients. And we'll reload over here. Okay, and if I go back to color now and I load it, then I can still create my own gradient. And you can see that the gradient that I chose from the default palette is still visible. But I can't choose a new one from that palette. I can only choose from theme or make my own. Now, if I go in to view the code of this block. And I think Lisa had a question: after a block is added to a page and post and published, any later changes to theme.json do not apply. Let's talk about that now. So if I go into the code view of my blocks and I find that group that I added this here. So I've got my group and I've applied this gradient with a name, with an ID to it, warm, cool to warm spectrum. WordPress is still loading those gradients. It doesn't remove them from the CSS that's generated and loaded into the site. It does remove the option to select it in the future. So it won't affect any of your existing content because we've already set that gradient here. You could create a new gradient that had this name, cool to warm spectrum, and it would change it then, override it in CSS or add another default and to your, or add a gradient to your gradient palette. But it's all of that styling is going to be retained, especially things that come from core. So, and it's a little bit of a safeguard in a way, because you wouldn't want the styling to be stripped away completely in most cases. So just know that sometimes the styles, like if we look at this group up here, this is what actually goes into the markup. We're setting some inline CSS here for the border with the width of 100 pixels, that it's a solid style, that we've got a 0 radius on it. So that actually is part of the block markup itself. So changing things in theme.json are not going to override that particular instance of that block on this post. Okay. All right, so let's switch back to the block editor view here. And now we can add this one last thing to our colors section. And I think, oh, it's already in there. I have terrible memory. True. Okay, so default gradients, we are going to set to true. Custom gradient, I'll set to false now. Lisa, don't worry, this is recorded, so if you want to scrub to that section, I did answer the question, but basically the style, the class is still in the block, and that's being pulled from core. So if it's a core default, then it'll still display even after you've removed these settings if it's existing content. Okay, so I just changed the custom gradient to false. And what that's going to do here, when I move back over to the site, is if I choose the color, I enable default again. So I have those default gradients back, but the option to set a custom default is gone. So I could only choose from the gradients that are loaded by the system, basically, whether that came from theme or from WordPress itself. All right, so that covers all of our color support. And as you can see, the idea is the same across all of these. Each of these settings is going to control some component that is being added to a block with some kind of a design control. So the next one is spacing. Lisa says, like an onion, so many layers. Yes. When we get into custom and block specific things, it is very much layered. Yes.
Question. Do the settings in theme.json override the defaults for a block that is configured in the blog.json file?
Sort of. So the block.json file is going to determine whether or not those components are loaded for that block. Theme.json cannot on its own load extra components that weren't already present in the block.json. Okay, so if the block didn't have a color option added by the block creator, then you can't add it from theme.json either. You would have to actually edit it at the block level. Does that make sense? But you can override the enable if that component, let's say the borders options are present in the block, you can disable them in theme.json. And if they're present in the block but turned off, you should be able to turn them on in theme.json.
Thank you.
Okay. So supports related to spacing. We have block gap. In the UI, this is going to be referred to as block spacing. And basically what it is, I think the only place it is right now is here on the buttons block, not the button block, but the buttons block. It's the wrapper block that goes around the buttons. We have block spacing here. So if I wanted to make these closer together, I can reduce the number, or I can increase the number. And what it does is it makes the space between the blocks be consistent. So that's kind of cool. And you can use that along with your justification. And I think with orientation, let's try putting a big number in here. Yeah, so it's the space all the way around the block. But if it's the first one on the left, it's not going to add that extra space to the left. It's the spacing between blocks. And so you can enable it and disable it with theme.json just like others. Then the next one we have is margin. For blocks that have the margin component enabled, you can disable it. Same for padding. And that is it for those. So we can go into spacing here. We don't have any supports here. We just have the presets for the units. And if I go in here, I can add block gap. And the default for block gap is actually null. I think if I change that to false, hopefully it will disable that option. I can do margin to false and padding to false. Okay. And so now if I go in here before I reload, let's see if I have anything that has those. Some of these are still being adopted by the core blocks, so it's sometimes a little tricky to find a block that actually has it. Oh, here we go. In the group block, I do have padding here as well as block spacing. So if let's see if, and margin is not here, but the default for margin actually is false. So if I select this now, you see the spacing option has gone away. So I can no longer set the padding or the block gap or spacing, block spacing from within the WordPress. Let's see. Carrie asked, does the block gap happen in the navigation as well? That is a moving target. So what is actually in WordPress for right now, let's try making a navigation block and see what we find. Okay, we'll make a simple one. Maybe we need to add another link. Okay, so we've got 2 links here. Let's see what we get. So I've got navigation. I'm gonna have to enable it to see it's there. And I know we're coming up on time here, so didn't want to put that same link in twice. That's interesting. It looks like right now spacing is not available, but I think it may be coming in WordPress 6. So Carlos very helpfully added a link to the core blocks reference guide, which talks about the supports that are included in each of the blocks, which is very helpful. There are going to be things in here that are not in theme.json. So you kind of have to cross-reference the two together. All right. All right, there was one more thing. Oh, so this is a whole nother big section that I don't have time to demonstrate everything, but we also have all of our typography options, and all of these are still design controls. They can all be enabled and disabled in the same way that we've done so far. And these are just toggles. They're either on or they're off. And if the block has it and you turn it off, then it doesn't have it anymore. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist anymore. It just means that it's been disabled from view. All right, and we have one last thing that I wanted to get to very quickly, which is appearance tools. So basically, appearance tools was added as a bit of a helper setting to enable or disable a group of things altogether. So the default for this is false. And these are the things that it enables. We've got our 4 border things, color, radius, style, and width. We have our link color, and we have our 3 spacing things. So if I go in and let's say I wanted to get rid of everything that we've added so far, I'm gonna just go back to the very beginning here. Okay. And then I can see that I actually believe this was already enabled under, here we are. Get rid of that. All right, so I have my appearance tools right now is set to false. I'm going to change that back to true, which is what it was when we got here. And what that will do is make sure that those things are actually enabled. So the things that were in that list. So if we choose a block that has these things, I can see I've got my link color here. I have my, what was it? All of the border things and all of the spacing things. So I've got my border items, and then I have my block spacing and padding. And if there was something that had margin as an option, that would also be here. And if I change it back to false, all of those things will go back to their default values. All right, so that is basically the supports in a nutshell. It's one of the less difficult concepts to grasp in theme.json, I think. I think it's really helpful if you're building sites for others to be able to, decide which things they have access to, and hopefully we'll get more control over those different block things so that our supports options match more closely with what is in this core blocks reference, so that we could do things like maybe change it so you can't change the align, or some of the other supports options that are in here. So I hope that you found this to be helpful. I'll get the video for today posted on YouTube, hopefully by the end of the day. And I hope to see you next week when we'll talk about presets, I believe, the other part of theme.json settings. So have a great day, everyone. I appreciate you.